Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about the St. Michael Lent. So this has been popping off lately, which is crazy because this is actually a very ancient devotion that goes all the way back to medieval times, to the time of St. Francis. So St. Francis kind of made it famous back then, and it takes place between August 15th, which is the feast of Our Lady of the Assumption, of course, a holy day of obligation here in the United States, and the Feast of the Archangels on September 29th. Of course, St. Michael is an archangel along with St. Raphael and St. Gabriel. So St. Francis actually received his stigmata during this time in the year 1224. That's how far back it goes, people, to 1224. He received his stigmata, and it's a time of prayer, penance, and fasting, very similar to Lent. Again, like I said, it's become very popular right now, and some of the things that people like to do is really dive into a devotion to St. Michael. So here are some of the ways that you can do that. First off, pray the St. Michael prayer. This is a very old prayer that came around from the 1800s by Pope Leo XIII. He wrote the St. Michael prayer after having a prophetic vision. And then there's also the Chaplet of St. Michael, and of course the Litany of St. Michael. There's also the Litany to the Holy Angels. There's the Litany to Guardian Angels. That's all recommended as well. St. Francis just had this big devotion to angels. We don't know if he started the St. Michael Lent, but he definitely participated in it very frequently. St. Bonaventure, who is of course a doctor of the church, wrote a biography on St. Francis and wrote about his devotion during it. So let me tell you a little bit more about St. Francis and his devotion to the angels, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the St. Michael Lent itself. So we all know St. Francis had this very luxurious, he was rich, and then he gave all of that up, took the vow of poverty, became a Franciscan. He was never a priest, but he took that life of poverty. And I'm just going to read directly from this article. I'll have the article linked down below. Shortly after his conversion, Francis worked to rebuild 3 crumbling churches in the area around Assisi, including one consecrated to Saint Mary of the Angels. Francis believed this church was particularly favored by the angels and made his home there out of reverence for them. Indeed, Francis' love for the angels was lifelong and profound. St. Bonaventure, a doctor of the church, a Franciscan bishop, and leader of Francis's order, the Friars Minor, wrote extensively about the life of St. Francis and repeatedly pointed out Francis' devotion to the holy angels. In one passage, Bonaventure wrote, "Francis joined by a chain of inseparable love to the angels. Because of his devotion to the angels, he used to fast and pray constantly. During the 40 days after the Assumption of the Glorious Virgin, because of the fervent zeal he had for the salvation of all, he was devoted with special love to Blessed Michael the Archangel." Sometimes we forget about the angels because we think of the saints and everything, but St. Francis did not forget. He loved them so much he dedicated this time of prayer and fasting to them. But that was not the only time of the year he fasted. St. Francis was kind of fasting all year. October was one of the few months he was not fasting. He did not advise that the laity do as many fasts as he does because, of course, he was a saint. He was in this life of poverty. He was doing all this. He was able to do this. However, he was fasting so much that at times he would be starving himself and he was starting to go blind. And of course, when you're starving yourself or when you're being starved, blindness is something that does happen. We don't know exactly if this was because of his fasting or if this was because of different illness. Medieval times, what are we going to do? But St. Francis had this great devotion. I'm so glad that we're bringing it back. So during St. Michael's Lent, we are encouraged to observe different things such as daily prayer, right? This is a great time. If you're not in the habit of praying the rosary every single day, maybe try and start that. If that is too much for you, maybe start just by praying a decade. Of course, daily mass is also an option. I've talked about this before. I think it is so good if you work in an office and you can go to daily mass at lunchtime and your coworkers say, "Hey, where are you going to lunch today?" And you say, "Oh, I'm going to mass." I'm telling you, as someone who used to work in an office and do this, your secular friends and your non-practicing Catholic friends are gonna be like, "What? You can go to mass during the week? I thought it was only on Sundays." No, we go to mass every single day. Of course, if daily mass is too much for you, maybe try and go to one daily mass a week. Then it's encouraged that you choose a form of penance. So something like giving up meat on Fridays. We don't have to do that in the United States. and other countries they do. In the United States, we do not have to give up meat on Fridays as long as you give up something else. But during the St. Michael Lent, maybe think about giving up meat on Fridays. I personally will be doing that this year. Charity, is there a way that you can be more charitable? Is who can you reach out to? Who can you see? What volunteering can you do? And then of course, just praying to Our Lady and praying to St. Michael and praying to St. Francis, I think as well. I haven't seen anyone recommending to pray to St. Francis, but since St. Francis made it famous, maybe really try and look into some St. Francis prayers as well. So there is the Little Flowers of St. Francis, the St. Francis biography by St. Bonaventure that you can purchase today on Amazon. It was written, I think, 30 years after St. Francis passed away. So that's a really good source material if you're looking for something to read. During this time, I really encourage you to do some kind of spiritual reading, whether it be the St. Francis books, or maybe a book on St. Michael. Definitely scriptural reading is great. St. Michael is referenced multiple times in scripture right here on the screen in the book of Daniel and in Revelation as well. Definitely look into that. But Padre Pio, of course, a Franciscan, wrote, "The harm that comes to souls from the lack of reading holy books makes me shudder. What power spiritual reading has to lead a change of course and to make even worldly people enter into the way of perfection." You guys, if you don't read holy books throughout the year, if you don't read some kind of spiritual reading throughout the year, take this time during the St. Michael Lent to do so. And of course, the St. Michael Lent is not required. It is a devotion. And sometimes as Catholics, we might overwhelm ourselves with devotion. But if you are looking for something to do, this is definitely recommended. Again, it's popping off. A lot of people are doing it right now. But if you feel overwhelmed, you don't have to do it. And you don't have to do everything. You don't have to go crazy during this time of St. Michael Lent. But I'm very excited. I can't believe I'm participating for the first time ever. So I'm excited. I think this is going to be really good for my spiritual growth, and I hope it is for yours as well. So thank you guys so much for watching. Can you let me know in the comments what you are doing for St. Michael Lent? If you're not participating, maybe why? And yeah, let me know if you liked this video. Give it a thumbs up, hit the bell, and hit subscribe so you never miss one of my videos. I appreciate you so much, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye!